Hello and welcome to Indica's Point Blank Show, which is basically an excuse for us to spend some time talking to extremely insightful people from around the world. I'm your host Aditya, and along with me I have Abhishek and Niranjana as well for this particular episode. The person who we have on call with us for this episode was only 22 years of age when he completed his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He has authored 11 books so far on various subjects, is a current member of Parliament from Thiruvananthapuram in India, is also the Indian Minister of State for External Affairs, and someone who also the media has been picking on for every 140 character that he has been typing on Twitter. The person who we have on phone with us is Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Hello, Dr. Tharoor, and thank you for being with us on the Point Blank Show. I understand and I completely realize that you are an extremely busy person, and so I'm going to directly get into the questions. Now, Dr. Tharoor, you are an extremely eloquent guy. You are highly educated. You are highly qualified. My mother thinks that you are a handsome-looking minister. You are everything that an Indian politician isn't supposed to be or hasn't been. So what are you doing in Indian politics?
Well, first of all, I think that's a very unfair statement about all other Indian politicians. I find lots of Indian politicians who are well-educated, well-spoken, internationally experienced, and good-looking. So, flattered though I am by your praise, I don't think I'm in any way unique. Having said that, I think the whole point about a democracy's politics is that it can represent the country in all its rich diversity. We should have room in our democracy for people representing various kinds of backgrounds, experiences, ethnicities, languages, class interests, educational backgrounds. That's the sort of thing that a vast country like India should have. I mean, the famous line of Bill Clinton when he was president was that his cabinet should look like America. But I think our parliament should look like India. And so rather than just having one particular kind of, as you seem to imply, stereotyped politician, I think in our democracy, as we grow and mature, we should have room for various kinds of people in the garb of politicians. And I'm delighted to be adding to the mix.
Exactly, Mr. Tharoor. We take pride in describing India as the world's largest democracy. And democracy implies that everyone has a right to their own opinion. Mm-hmm. However, in recent times, there have been several instances, whether it's Jaswant Singh's controversial book or your cattle class remark. Is there room for individual thought in politics?
Well, I mean, Jaswant Singh's book is still available. Indeed, it got unbanned in the one state in which it was wrongly banned. And as for me, I'm still in government and still in parliament and still in public life. So, public opinion is large and diverse. There will be some who won't like some of the things we say or do. And we will have to take a few lumps and a few knocks as we go along. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we've become an intolerant society. It means that there are some things which test constantly the limits of our expression. I mean, there is no question that Mr. Jaswant Singh's party had no room for his view of Jinnah. And there is a clear indication that a remark, a completely innocent remark from the point of view of an English speaker, about cattle class, which was a phrase used in the question and therefore repeated in my answer, sounds very bad when translated into other languages. And we are a multilingual democracy, and the fact is that many people wrongly assume that there was this arrogant minister dismissing all economy class travelers as cattle. And of course there were people motivated for political reasons who were trying to peddle such an interpretation of my phrase. That is essentially what happened in this particular case. But I would not draw apocalyptic conclusions from that about the society as a whole. I think there is room for expression. And the fact that both the examples you gave, they both survived and are continuing and slightly bruised, that's also part of the political experience.
So, Dr. Tharoor, do you think Indian media or, say, Indian politics lacks a sense of humor?
No, I would say that India as a whole has a sense of humor, but that language is an important factor in humor. And in public life, and particularly in political life, jokes that don't translate well across languages will have to be avoided. In fact, some years ago I wrote an essay about the lack of political humor in India, and it's an updated version of it has been published in my last book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, lamenting the absence of political humor, but having tried and become a cropper myself, I recognize why political humor is so difficult in our democracy. It's because we have a lively and thriving media in 20-odd different languages who will essentially interpret your joke as their linguistic sensibility teaches them to do, and that could often come at the expense of the joke teller.
Well, continuing from this lighter note, how was the transition from wearing a suit and a tie in the UN that you spent 20 years to learning to tie a dhoti and standing on top of a jeep with frenzied supporters chanting slogans in the Kerala heat? How was that all about?
Well, tying a dhoti or a munda, as we call it in the south, is something I've done every time I go to Kerala. That was not new. I've actually been quite frequently seen and photographed, as it were, in Kerala garb, because I used to go to Kerala every year with my family, and I still have my grandmother in the old ancestral village, where wearing anything but a munda would be awkward. So that was not in and of itself a challenge. But certainly standing on the jeep, as you said, or various other places, being cheered and chaired and hurled abuse at and addressing audiences of thousands in a language that I previously only used for casual social conversation, all of that was new and all of that was changed. But it was important for me to do it because, when I first entered politics, I came from this background as somebody who had lived abroad for 3 decades, who had, had this verified United Nations career, ending up as Under Secretary General. So it was important for me to demonstrate to the voters that I wasn't just that I'd done all of those things, but I could also do other things, that I could wear a munda and not just a silk and tie, that I could trudge the hot fields and streets and tea shops of Trivandrum in the hottest month of the year, and not just sit in air-conditioned offices, that I could speak to them in Malayalam from the heart, not the fancy Sahitya Malayalam that the politicians specialized in, but a simple, colloquial, but nonetheless clear and comprehensible Malayalam, and that I could, in other words, give voice to their concerns credibly. I had to earn the right, in my view, to represent them, to be in politics, and that's exactly what I was able to do through my campaign effort.
Right, so you went in well aware that there are certain perceptions that probably might be working against you, and you already had some sort of a strategy going forward as to how you're going to be approaching this whole thing.
Well, no, I came in, as people tend to from the outside, with the notion of politics as an exercise in principles and ideals and debating the challenges of development. In fact, my initial campaign approach was all focused on the development of Trivandrum. And in fact, what was interesting was that my opponents, who knew Kerala and Trivandrum well, could have perhaps attacked me on the depth of my understanding of the development challenge of the constituency, but instead they chose to attack me as an individual. And the campaign became one about whether I, as a person, was somebody who could represent the people, which actually in the end turned out to be a very comfortable ground for me to be on, because I manifestly was not the kind of person they were caricaturing me as being, and the more the voters saw me and heard me, the more they turned out to be willing to support me. And the result was that I got the best majority that any Congress candidate had got in Trivandrum in over 30 years.
But why do you think you took that? I mean, the question that I have for you is that you spent a considerable amount of time in UN before joining Indian politics. Now, did that reputation precede you or help you in any way while you were contesting this election?
Well, I think in some ways it both helped and hindered with a certain elite, as it were, that was familiar with. I mean, there were certainly newspaper readers who had seen my name, but by and large, it was a percentage of the electorate that had read my books in translation into Malayalam, that had known of me from newspaper coverage of my previous activities and statements, and therefore perhaps had preconceived notions about me. It seems for the most part positive, though some clearly were inclined to be negative about that experience. But having said that, I was still somebody who had to introduce himself to the bulk of the voters. And that process of introduction involved a process of discovery, which fortunately in the end turned out to be not unhappy for me when the voters discovered who I was.
Well, that's good. And, you used internet thoroughly, so reaching out to the young audience wasn't a problem for you. The educated classes probably had read your books. But how did you manage to reach out to, the housewives or to the grandmothers or to, the laborers out there?
Through entirely conventional means, because, the internet approach, we actually had a website, and we discovered that from the usage analysis we were getting from the Seva server provider, that only about 10% of those using the website were actually from the constituency, or rather, to put it more accurately, that only about 10% of the electorate were having access to the internet as a means of information. We hoped that that 10% included a lot of media people, and therefore what we were putting out on the internet was being refracted through them into the general public space through the mainstream mass media. But otherwise, what we had to do was very conventional direct campaigning. So I went out, to a lot of community halls and gatherings. I addressed women's groups. I addressed social service organizations. I addressed community organizations like the Tamil Sangam, with the Tamil-speaking voters of my constituency, a very small minority, but nonetheless important. And then I did a lot of the classic going through neighborhoods. There are two sort of classic approaches. One is you show up at an intersection and you knock on every door and every tea shop and every hotel and every shop and ask for votes, which I did several times, obviously, in various parts of my constituency. And the other technique is to go on top of this converted jeep and then stop every few minutes and deliver a 2-3 minute speech to the people waiting at pre-designated spots. And a lot of the people waiting were the kinds of people you're talking about, middle class and lower class and poor people, including large numbers of women, of all ages, including older women. And this is how I was able to be seen and heard.
And I'm sure you might have had a lot of interesting experiences. For example, you might have taken these unplanned stops at places and had wonderful exchanges or conversations with people.
Sure. No, in fact, one of my most memorable moments was when I leapt off the jeep one day when I saw a bunch of women, manifestly poor women, working in a very muddy and slushy field, and I rushed towards them, and they came out when they saw me alighting to approach me, and the one woman said, "Oh, don't come too close, so we're all covered in dirt." And I said, "But your dirt is building the nation. Tell me who you are, what you're doing." And it turned out these were poor women from the constituency who were being employed under what is now called the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which guarantees 100 days of paid employment to one member of every poor rural family. So these are people who were doing this project in order to earn those 100 days of minimum wage, which in Kerala in those days was 125 rupees a day. It's now gone up to 160. But the women's stories were really moving. They were all basically the ones who were providing for their families with this work. And one woman told me how she had a handicapped daughter, and that the only way she was able to keep that daughter at home with her was because of the money she was making from this particular work. And it was profoundly both revelatory of the desperation and the needs of my own voters, but equally of how effective government can be if it provides an opportunity like this through a scheme like this to actually put money in the hands of people who are willing to work for it, so that they don't lose their dignity in that process. They do useful work, sort of minor development work, and at the same time they're able to proceed and get a decent living out of it.
Yeah. One last question about your writing, if you don't mind.
All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, writing and diplomacy are at two different ends. In diplomacy, there's a lot of reading between the lines, whereas in writing, one has to be as descriptive and vivid as possible. So how do you reconcile the fact that your hobby and profession are at two different ends? And secondly, where on earth do you find the time to write so much?
Well, I don't find any time to write anymore, I'm afraid. But when I did manage to do it, I would have disagreed with your characterization, because, in fact, both writing and diplomacy require the careful, sensible, and precise use of words to convey precisely the degree of clarity or ambiguity that you desire. In my novels, I often raise questions that I consciously don't answer. I want the reader to do some thinking for themselves. I use humor and wordplay, but I also have very often two possible interpretations of the events I'm describing or the lines that are being spoken by my characters. In diplomacy, there are often things you say, and how you say them matter. There are often things you leave unsaid, and what you choose not to say matters. And that's very true in good creative writing as well.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Tharoor. Those were the questions that we had for you, and I appreciate the fact that you took out time to be on our show.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye. And for people out there who are listening to this, if you have any comments on whatever has been discussed, please log on to www.theindicast.com and leave your comment out there. That's about it. Bye-bye.